And welcome to Growth Daily Books, where you can acquire the essential knowledge and stories found in books through this book review podcast. In this episode, I'll share with you principles, concepts, stories, and lessons found in Madsen Pirie's book, How to Win Every Argument. So sit back, relax, grab a pen and paper, and let's get started. How to Win Every Argument is a book by British philosopher and logician Madsen Pirie that teaches readers how to win any argument by using logical techniques and principles. The book is divided into three main sections: the techniques of argument, the principles of argument, and the art of persuasion. In the first section, Pirie covers the basics of logical argumentation, including the use of evidence and the burden of proof. He emphasizes the importance of supporting one's claims with concrete evidence and of being able to back up one's arguments with facts. He also discusses fallacies, which are errors in reasoning that can undermine the validity of an argument. Some common fallacies include ad hominem attacks, straw man arguments, and appeal to ignorance. Pirie advises readers to be on the lookout for fallacies and to avoid using them in their own arguments. A logical fallacy is a mistake in reasoning that can undermine the validity of an argument. Here are some of the common fallacies discussed in the book that you should be aware of and avoid using. Ad hominem fallacy. This occurs when someone attacks the person making an argument rather than the argument itself. This fallacy is often used as a way to discredit an opponent's argument without actually addressing the substance of the argument. For example, if someone says you're wrong because you're stupid, this is an ad hominem fallacy because it attacks the person's intelligence rather than the argument they are making. To avoid this fallacy, it is important to focus on the substance of an argument and to avoid personal attacks. Straw man fallacy. This occurs when someone misrepresents or exaggerates an opponent's argument in order to make it easier to attack. This fallacy is often used as a way to make an opponent's argument seem weaker or more extreme than it actually is. For example, if someone says you want to ban all guns, which is ridiculous, this is a straw man fallacy because it misrepresents the opponent's position by implying that they want to ban all guns, when in fact they may only want to regulate certain types of firearms. To avoid this fallacy, it is important to accurately represent an opponent's argument and to focus on the substance of the argument rather than mischaracterizing it. False dilemma. This occurs when someone presents two options as the only possibilities, when there may be other options available. This fallacy is often used as a way to narrow the scope of a debate and to force people to choose between two options that may not be the only possibilities. For example, if someone says you either support gun control or you support the right to bear arms, this is a false dilemma because there may be other options available, such as regulating certain types of firearms or requiring background checks for gun purchases. To avoid this fallacy, it is important to consider all of the possible options and to avoid limiting the scope of the debate to just two options. Begging the question. This occurs when someone assumes the truth of the conclusion in the premise of an argument. This fallacy is often used as a way to present an argument as self-evident or self-explanatory, when in fact the argument may be based on an assumption that needs to be proven. For example, if someone says God exists because the Bible says so, this is begging the question because it assumes the truth of the conclusion that God exists in the premise that the Bible is true. To avoid this fallacy, it is important to ensure that the premise of an argument is supported by evidence and to avoid assuming the truth of the conclusion. Slippery slope. This occurs when someone argues that a small change will lead to a chain of events that will ultimately result in a negative outcome. This fallacy is often used as a way to scare people into opposing a change or policy by suggesting that it will have unintended and far-reaching consequences. For example, if someone says if we allow gay marriage, it will lead to people marrying animals. This is a slippery slope fallacy because it suggests that a small change, allowing gay marriage, will lead to a chain of events, people marrying animals, that is unlikely to occur. To avoid this fallacy, it is important to consider the evidence and to avoid making predictions about future events that are not supported by evidence. Appeal to authority. This occurs when someone cites an authority or expert as evidence for their argument without providing any additional evidence to support their claim. This fallacy is often used as a way to lend credibility to an argument by citing an authority figure, but it can be problematic because it relies on the credibility of the authority rather than on the strength of the argument itself. For example, if someone says Dr. X says that vaccines are safe, so they must be, this is an appeal to authority because it relies on the credibility of Dr. X as an expert to support the claim about vaccines rather than providing any additional evidence to support the claim. To avoid this fallacy, it is important to consider the evidence and to not rely solely on the credibility of an authority figure to support an argument. In the section on the techniques of argument, Pirie cites the example of the burden of proof to illustrate the principle that the person making a claim is responsible for providing evidence to support it. He uses the example of a court case where the prosecution is responsible for providing evidence to support its claim that the defendant is guilty. He also cites the example of a politician who makes a claim about a policy proposal but fails to provide evidence to support it. In both cases, the lack of evidence undermines the validity of the argument. Pirie advises readers to be aware of the burden of proof and to ensure that they have sufficient evidence to support their claims. He also advises readers to challenge their opponent's claims if they do not have sufficient evidence to support them. The principle of charity. The principle of charity is the idea that when evaluating an argument, one should give the argument the benefit of the doubt and interpret it in the most favorable way possible. Pirie advises readers to apply the principle of charity when evaluating their own arguments, as well as those of their opponents, in order to ensure that they are engaging in fair and reasonable debate. The principle of falsifiability. The principle of falsifiability is the idea that a claim or argument is only meaningful if it is possible to test it and potentially prove it false. Pirie advises readers to be aware of this principle and to ensure that their claims and arguments are testable and open to challenge. He also advises readers to challenge the falsifiability of their opponent's claims in order to undermine their argument. The second section of the book, The Principles of Argument, covers more advanced concepts in argumentation. Pirie discusses the use of rhetorical devices such as rhetorical questions and rhetorical repetition to make arguments more compelling. He also emphasizes the importance of framing an argument or presenting it in a way that is most favorable to one's position. He discusses the role of emotion in argumentation and how to use it effectively to persuade others. He also covers the concept of Occam's razor, which is a principle that states that when faced with multiple explanations for a phenomenon, the simplest one is most likely to be correct. In the section on the principles of argument, Pirie cites the example of a politician who uses rhetorical repetition to make his argument more compelling. He uses the example of a politician who repeats the phrase, lower taxes, more jobs, multiple times in a speech in order to drive home his point. Pirie also cites the example of a politician who uses a rhetorical question to frame his argument in a way that is favorable to his position. Framing an argument. The principle of framing an argument involves presenting an argument in a way that makes it more likely to be accepted by the audience. This can involve choosing the right words, using examples and analogies, and positioning the argument in a context that makes it more appealing to the audience. Here is an example of how you might use the principle of framing an argument. Suppose you want to argue that everyone should have access to affordable health care. One way to frame this argument is to focus on the personal consequences of not having access to health care, such as the financial burden of medical bills or the risk of not being able to get treatment for serious medical conditions. This approach frames the argument in a way that appeals to the audience's self-interest and concern for their own well-being. Another way to frame this argument is to appeal to the audience's sense of fairness and justice. You might argue that everyone has a right to healthcare and that it is unfair for some people to be denied access to it because of their financial circumstances. This approach frames the argument in a way that appeals to the audience's sense of morality and justice. Overall, the principle of framing an argument involves presenting an argument in a way that is most likely to be accepted by the audience by appealing to their values, concerns, and interests. By using this principle, you can make your arguments more persuasive and effective. Role of emotion in argumentation. The role of emotion in argumentation notes that emotions can play a powerful role in influencing people's beliefs and decisions. He suggests that by understanding and using emotions effectively, you can make your arguments more persuasive and effective. One way to use the role of emotion in argumentation is to appeal to the audience's emotions in a way that supports your argument. For example, if you are trying to persuade someone to support a charity that helps hungry children, you might use emotional appeals by showing them pictures or stories of children who are suffering from malnutrition. This can create an emotional response in the audience that might make them more receptive to your argument and more likely to support the charity. Another way to use the role of emotion in argumentation is to try to defuse negative emotions that might be blocking the audience from accepting your argument. For example, if you are trying to persuade someone to support a policy that they strongly oppose, you might try to understand and address the emotional reasons behind their opposition. This could involve acknowledging their concerns and addressing any fears or misperceptions they might have about the policy. By addressing the emotional barriers to acceptance, you can make your argument more persuasive and effective. Overall, the principle of the role of emotion in argumentation suggests that emotions can play a powerful role in influencing people's beliefs and decisions, and that by understanding and using emotions effectively, you can make your arguments more persuasive and effective. Occam's razor. The principle of Occam's razor is a principle of parsimony that suggests that when presented with multiple explanations for a phenomenon, the simplest explanation is most likely to be true. This principle is named after the 14th century English logician and Franciscan friar William of Ockham, who is credited with popularizing it. One way to use the principle of Occam's razor in argumentation is to use it as a way to evaluate the strength of different arguments or explanations. When presented with multiple explanations for a phenomenon, you can use Occam's razor to help you choose the explanation that is most parsimonious or simple. For example, suppose you're trying to determine the cause of a malfunction in a piece of equipment. One explanation might be that the equipment was damaged during shipping, while another explanation might be that it was damaged by a power surge. Using Occam's razor, you might choose the explanation that the equipment was damaged during shipping because it is the simpler explanation and therefore more likely to be true. Another way to use the principle of Occam's razor in argumentation is to use it as a way to challenge arguments or explanations that are unnecessarily complex or that rely on unnecessary assumptions. For example, suppose someone is trying to argue that a particular event was caused by a conspiracy, but their argument relies on a series of convoluted and unlikely assumptions. Using Occam's razor, you could challenge their argument by pointing out that the simpler explanation is more likely to be true and that their argument relies on unnecessary and implausible assumptions. Overall, the principle of Occam's razor suggests that when presented with multiple explanations for a phenomenon, the simplest explanation is most likely to be true, and that by using this principle, you can evaluate the strength of different arguments and explanations. Some of the key ideas and techniques covered in this section include the principle of non-contradiction. The principle of non-contradiction is the idea that a statement cannot be both true and false at the same time. Pirie advises readers to be aware of this principle and to ensure that their arguments do not contradict themselves. He also advises readers to challenge the non-contradiction of their opponent's arguments in order to undermine their argument. The principle of excluded middle. The principle of excluded middle is the idea that a statement must be either true or false, and there is no middle ground. Pirie advises readers to be aware of this principle and to ensure that their arguments do not leave room for ambiguity or uncertainty. He also advises readers to challenge the excluded middle of their opponent's arguments in order to undermine their argument. The principle of identity. The principle of identity is the idea that an object or concept is the same as itself. Pirie advises readers to be aware of this principle and to ensure that their arguments do not confuse different concepts or objects. He also advises readers to challenge the identity of their opponent's arguments in order to undermine their argument. In the final section of the book, The Art of Persuasion, Pirie focuses on the importance of persuasion in argumentation and offers tips for persuading others effectively. He advises readers to use rhetorical devices such as rhetorical questions and rhetorical repetition to make their arguments more compelling. He also emphasizes the importance of presenting a confident and passionate demeanor in order to be more persuasive. He also cites the example of a politician who uses emotional appeals, such as fear or patriotism, to persuade voters to support his position. Some of the key ideas and techniques covered in this section include emotional appeals. Pirie advises readers to use emotional appeals such as fear or patriotism to persuade others to adopt their point of view. He argues that emotional appeals can be very effective in influencing others, but warns that they should be used carefully and ethically. Rhetorical devices. Pirie advises readers to use rhetorical devices such as repetition or rhetorical questions to make their arguments more compelling. He argues that these devices can help to engage the audience and to make the argument more memorable. Suppose you're trying to persuade your audience to support a policy that would increase funding for schools in your community. One way to use a rhetorical device to make your argument more persuasive is to use repetition. You might repeat key phrases or ideas throughout your argument to emphasize their importance and to make them more memorable to your audience. For example, you might say, investing in education is investing in the future. Investing in education is investing in our children. Investing in education is investing in our community. By repeating this phrase, you are reinforcing the idea that investing in education has a number of benefits, and you are making it more likely that your audience will remember this idea. Another way to use a rhetorical device in an argument is to use rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions are questions that are asked for the purpose of making a point, rather than seeking an answer. For example, you might say, why wouldn't we want to invest in the future of our children and our community? Why wouldn't we want to give our children the best possible education? By asking these questions, you are inviting your audience to consider the benefits of investing in education, and you are making it more likely that they will see the value of your argument. Overall, rhetorical devices are techniques that speakers and writers use to persuade their audience, and by using them effectively, you can make your arguments more persuasive and effective. Confidence and enthusiasm. Pirie advises readers to use confident body language and enthusiastic language to persuade others to adopt their point of view. He argues that confidence and enthusiasm are contagious and can help to win over the audience. Here's an example of how you might use confidence and enthusiasm to make your argument more persuasive. Suppose you are trying to persuade your audience to support a policy that would increase funding for schools in your community. One way to use confidence and enthusiasm to make your argument more persuasive is to speak with conviction and energy. You might use strong and assertive body language, maintain eye contact with your audience, and speak with a clear and confident voice. By doing so, you can create an impression of conviction and enthusiasm that will make your argument more persuasive. Another way to use confidence and enthusiasm to make your argument more persuasive is to show your passion and belief in your argument. You might use personal anecdotes or examples to illustrate your points and to show why you believe in your argument. For example, you might tell a story about a student who benefited from increased funding for their school, or you might share statistics or research that supports your argument. By showing your passion and belief in your argument, you can make it more persuasive and effective. Madsen Pirie also covers a number of other useful techniques and principles in how to win every argument. For example, Pirie discusses the importance of anticipating counter-arguments and being prepared to address them. He advises readers to think like the opposition and to consider what arguments their opponents might make in order to be better prepared to defend their own position. Here's an example of how you might use the principle of thinking like your opposition in argumentation. Suppose you are trying to persuade your audience to support a policy that would increase funding for schools in your community, but you know that some members of your audience are opposed to the policy because they believe it will result in higher taxes. One way to use the principle of thinking like your opposition to make your argument more persuasive is to anticipate and address their concerns directly. You might start by acknowledging that taxes are a sensitive issue and that you understand why some people might be opposed to the policy. You might then present evidence to show that the benefits of increased funding for schools outweigh the costs of higher taxes, or you might offer alternative suggestions for funding the policy. By anticipating and addressing your opposition's concerns directly, you can make your argument more persuasive and effective. Pirie also discusses the concept of red herrings, which are distractions or irrelevancies introduced into an argument in order to mislead or confuse. He advises readers to be on the lookout for red herrings and to avoid introducing them into their own arguments. Suppose you are trying to persuade your audience to support a policy that would increase funding for schools in your community, but you know that some members of your audience are opposed to the policy because they believe it will result in higher taxes. One way to use a red herring in this situation is to introduce unrelated or tangential arguments in an attempt to distract from the main issue of increased funding for schools. For example, you might try to change the subject by bringing up unrelated issues like crime rates or the state of the economy in an attempt to divert attention from the policy being discussed. By introducing unrelated or tangential arguments, you are attempting to distract from the main issue and to mislead or confuse your audience. He also covers the concept of sunk costs, which refers to the idea that the resources one has already invested in a project or decision should not be taken into account when deciding whether to continue with it. He also covers the concept of loaded language, which refers to the use of words or phrases that have strong emotional connotations in order to persuade or influence others. Finally, Pirie discusses the importance of being open-minded and willing to change one's position in the face of new evidence or arguments. He advises readers to stay open to the truth and to be willing to revise their views if they are shown to be incorrect. Overall, How to Win Every Argument is a comprehensive guide to argumentation and persuasion. It covers the basics of logical argumentation as well as more advanced concepts and offers practical tips for persuading others effectively. The book is well written and engaging, making it a valuable resource for anyone looking to improve their argumentation skills. If you enjoyed this micro podcast, you may subscribe to receive daily bite-sized book reviews and summaries to grow yourself and your career with topics in skills development, business, relationship, and life in general. Only at Growth Daily Books.